Hello, I'm here in historic Indianola, Texas, site of the first settlement of the Louisiana Purchase by the French explorer La Salle. He was looking for the Mississippi, he overshot it, and he landed here. And of course, the settlers didn't get any help from King Louis XIV, and it kind of dwindled. But in the 1840s, the Germans landed in this area and built it up. It was the most thriving port on the whole coastline of Texas. And today, it would be equal to what Houston is, had not some hurricanes changed the course. It was right here in Indianola that they invented the process of canning beef in tin cans for the first time ever. That was invented right here. And they had refrigeration units here, one of the few places to have refrigerated storage. It was that advanced. In 1875, a hurricane changed it, wiped it out. They tried to rebuild it, and 11 years later, 1866, a second hurricane finished it off. And somewhere behind me is where the courthouse lies, underwater from the hurricane. And there may yet be another catastrophe coming into this same area, as it's somewhere near the southern end of the New Madrid fault line that is probably going to crack open if the United States divides Israel. And it's been prophesied by many people, as we'll look at, that that is exactly what's going to happen.
We're here this afternoon to change the course of history. After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East. Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain will establish embassies, exchange ambassadors. Together, these agreements will serve as the foundation for a comprehensive peace across the entire region, something which nobody thought was possible, certainly not in this day and age, maybe in many decades from now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, this day is a pivot of history. It heralds a new dawn of peace. And the blessings of the peace we make today will be enormous. First, because this peace will eventually expand to include other Arab states, and ultimately, it can end the Arab-Israeli conflict once and for all.
President Trump has seemingly pulled off a very difficult task, getting two more Arab nations to make peace with Israel. Since Israel was founded in 1948, only two other Arab nations have agreed to a declaration of peace. On March the 26th of 1979, Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. This peace was premised on America promising an annual $1.3 billion to Egypt, as well as military assistance. So in effect, Egypt was paid to make peace. Because of this, it has been called a cold peace. On July 25th of 1994, Israel and Jordan signed the Washington Declaration, which ended all official hostility between them. Jordan's King Hussein only agreed to the treaty after U.S. President Bill Clinton promised that Jordan's debts would be forgiven. So Jordan, too, was paid to make peace with Israel. The Abraham Accords peace treaty is somewhat different than the previous two treaties in that neither the United Arab Emirates nor Bahrain are at war with Israel, and they both have great oil wealth, meaning that they probably wouldn't be influenced by a bribe in order to sign a treaty. Let's take a look at the document that they actually signed. It appears to be mainly a philosophical statement with very few concrete obligations. It contains generalized ideals such as, we encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue. We seek tolerance and respect for every person. We support science, art, medicine, and commerce. We seek to end radicalization and conflict. We pursue a vision of peace, security, and prosperity. What is the real motivating factor behind this treaty? Do these two oil-rich nations really have a desperate need for science, art, medicine, and commerce with Israel? Let's look at what, on the surface, appears to be missing from this treaty. A demand that Israel divide their land for a Palestinian state. The 1979 Israel-Egypt peace treaty carried the stipulation that Israel had to adhere to the United Nations Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. It says, convinced of the urgent necessity of the establishment of a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in the Mideast, in accordance with Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. Likewise, the 1994 Israeli-Jordan Peace Treaty declared that it was based on these same two United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338. What is it about UN Resolutions 242 and 338 that are so important? UN Resolution 242 was drafted after Israel's 1967 Six-Day War, and UN Resolution 338 was written right after Israel's 1973 Yom Kippur War. Resolution 338 simply states that Israel is to abide by Resolution 242. Here's the text of Resolution 242. First, it states that according to the rules, it is unacceptable to gain territory by war. Somehow, this age-old practice is now no longer permitted in the New World Order of the United Nations. It literally says, emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Second, it demands that Israel withdraw to the pre-1967 borders and give up all land acquired in the 1967 Six-Day War. It says, withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. The land that Israel acquired is shown on this map, starting from the dark blue region and expanding over the 6 days of June 5th through the 10th of 1967. Therefore, this means that the United Nations is demanding that Israel has to go back to the original dark blue territory. But if you look at all the land that God promised Abram, you will see that Israel only took what was legally theirs. On the same day, Jehovah made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Israel took the land all the way to the river of Egypt, just like God had given them, but they didn't even come close to going all the way north to the Euphrates. And now, as a result of the 1979 treaty, Israel has given Egypt back the Sinai Peninsula, even though it legally belonged to them. Now, with President Trump calling this treaty the Abraham Accords, you would think that everyone would give Israel back all the land that God had promised to Abraham, right? Well, sad to say, Even Israel's best friend doesn't recognize their covenant with Jehovah. This would be no problem if Israel's God was simply a powerless idol made with man's hands. But if Israel's God is the true and living God, watch out. From the very beginning of the Trump team's negotiations in 2017, it was understood that the Arab leaders were not going to sign a peace treaty without it including a Palestinian state. And yet, the text of the Abraham Accords doesn't mention any state of Palestine. How do you figure that? We can find a clue in what Bahrain's King Hamad told the United Nations. They signed the peace deal with Israel in order to guarantee that Israel didn't annex any more land. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates agreed to the accords in exchange for Israel backing down from implying sovereignty over the settlements. He said, "We consider this a cornerstone for achieving a just and comprehensive peace leading to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. The hope of a future Palestinian state is what is motivating these Arab nations to sign Trump's Abraham Accords. It's not economic development or commerce or tourism and trade that matters. It's not about science, art, and medicine, even though that's what's stated in the Accords. It's all about a side deal halting Israeli expansion and leading to the implementation of the same United Nations Resolution 242 as in the other two treaties with Egypt and Jordan. It's all about the art of the deal that you make on the side, the secret unwritten agreement. But these secrets are not unknown to the God of Abraham, who revealed the true intentions of Esau's descendants 2,500 years ago. Ezekiel prophesied that the Arab nations would pretend that they wanted God's land for themselves. Therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen and against all Idumea, which have appointed my land into their possession, with the joy of all their heart, with despiteful minds to cast it out for a prey. They don't really want the land. They just don't want Israel to have it. Once they get the land, they intend to plunder it and cast it aside. The Arabs don't care about the Palestinians either. They're just a convenient tool to help them steal God's land. Incredibly, it's much easier for a Palestinian to acquire American or Canadian citizenship than a passport of an Arab country. In Lebanon, for example, Palestinians are not allowed to work as physicians, journalists, pharmacists, or lawyers, as well as 46 other occupations. They can't own property, and they don't qualify for health care either. The Arab nations don't allow the Palestinians to assimilate, and therefore they place the full burden for their welfare solely on Israel. The Arab hostility towards their own cousins has caused the Palestinian refugees to be treated differently than all the other refugees. Well, why are Palestinian refugees different from all other refugees? First, the UN High Commission for Refugees has 19.9 million refugees under its jurisdiction, and it's helped to restart the lives of 50 million refugees since 1967. But the UN High Commission for Refugees doesn't deal with Palestinian refugees. The Palestinians are treated differently. A separate agency has been created for them. It's called the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA. And it has a different definition for a Palestinian refugee. Palestinian refugees include all descendants without limit. There were 750,000 Palestinian refugees in 1948. Now we have 5 million Palestinian refugees, and the number is still growing. Additionally, the UN Relief and Works Agency does not seek to resettle the Palestinians like they do any other refugee. That keeps them in perpetual limbo. This is very obviously designed to exacerbate the Palestinian problem and completely overwhelm Israel until the Arab nations can do away with the Hebrew nation. It's only a matter of time. Just take a look at this map of Israel. If we consider the entire land from the Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and we include the Gaza Strip, there are 6.8 million Jews and there's 7 million Arabs. The Arabs have already surpassed the Jews in numbers. This map shows the West Bank in a unique perspective that is overlooked on most other maps. The green-colored territories are completely controlled by Israel. Naturally, the bulk of Israel is colored green. But did you know that 60% of the West Bank is green too? Israel has attempted to counter the increasing number of Palestinians by keeping them divided into the broken up white areas where they can't impose a unified front. And instead of gradually handing over the green areas to Palestinian control, as was envisioned by the 1993 and 1995 Oslo Accords, Israel has not only held on to the green territories, but has constructed a myriad of settlements on them too. And as the Palestinians have continually turned down all offers for a state, Israel has capitalized on the situation by building more and more settlements. This is a defensive tactic as a small nation the size of New Jersey fights for survival with a deck of cards that is clearly stacked against them. In the Arabian eyes of the United Nations, a landmass the size of New Jersey is still way too big for Abraham's son of promise. President Trump has appointed his son-in-law as the chief architect for this Peace to Prosperity plan. The week before the Abraham Accords were signed, Jared Kushner revealed the true motive for this sudden peace treaty. It's to save the two-state solution. Israel was eating up the land, as he said, and this had to be stopped. The real agenda was to force a Palestinian state upon Israel, which was ready to annex its rightful territories, and it was only stopped because of President Trump's intervention. It was never about science, art and medicine, tourism and commerce, as the Abraham Accords state. It was always about dividing up God's land. According to Jared Kushner, in the first meetings with Palestinian Authority President Abbas, he said, "If you could get Israel to agree to a map, then the rest will be easy to figure out." Then Jared said, "Well, we did better than that. We got them, the Israelis, to agree to a state with a map." Did you get that? Israel has already secretly agreed to a Palestinian state and the exact borders it will encompass. Even though the Abraham Accords doesn't mention a Palestinian state, it was a prerequisite that Israel agree to dividing up their land along with a map of the exact borders before the Arab nations would come aboard. This truly is the art of the secret deal. So technically, America has already divided God's land. The maps have been made and the secret deal signed. It's just a matter of waiting until the time clause expires. The fuse has been lit, and now all it needs is time to burn down to the stick of dynamite. So here's the map that Israel has already agreed to. Trump's deal of the century. Notice how it specifically specifies a future state of Palestine. Now, here's another map showing Israel's borders from the 1949 armistice until June 1967. These are the borders that the United Nations Resolution 242 demands Israel retreat to. Note that the gray region called the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. This region has the sites where most of Israel's history occurred. It has Hebron, which was given to Caleb as a reward for his faithfulness. Later, David was anointed king of Judea and made Hebron the first capital of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as well as Sarah, Rebekah, and Leah, were buried in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. Yet this area is designated as a Palestinian area. The site of Shiloh is also in the northern gray area of the West Bank. Here's where the tabernacle stood, along with the Ark of the Covenant for several hundred years, and where the prophet Samuel ministered to Jehovah. Bethel, where Jacob saw the ladder extending up to heaven, is in this gray region too. Bethlehem, where the Messiah, Yeshua, was born, is also located in the gray area. The whole southern lobe of the West Bank is called Judea, from which the Jews get their name. Yet this is all earmarked to be delivered to the Palestinians. Now, let's superimpose President Trump's Palestinian state on top. He is allocating 70% of the West Bank to the Palestinians, as well as an extra lobe on the southern tip that never was occupied by Jordan. Additionally, an underground tunnel connects Gaza and 2 additional slices of Israeli real estate that were never claimed by anyone else. It seems that these extra allocations are designed to add up to a total area equal to the area occupied by Jordan pre-1967. Trump's Palestine is still not what the UN wants, but it comes close, except for Jerusalem, which Donald Trump has left mainly untouched except for a small portion on the east for a Palestinian headquarters. There should be an asterisk at the end of the Abraham Accord saying, "See attached map for secret side agreement." And who knows what President Trump has been telling the Palestinians? There may be another secret agreement with them, just like there was with Israel. And this agreement could allow a Palestinian state to have all of East Jerusalem. Why else would Bahrain's King Ahmad say this? "We consider this a cornerstone for achieving a just and comprehensive peace, leading to the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital." Bahrain is certainly expecting to get East Jerusalem. Would they have signed Trump's peace plan if he had told them definitely not? Of course not. They wouldn't have signed anything. According to Kushner, Netanyahu has said that he does not call what the Palestinians are being offered in the peace plan a state, but has no issue with the Trump administration labeling the territory as such. Well, that's the kind of convoluted statement that only a politician could make. Let's take a look at what God himself thinks about the land. Shouldn't that be all that really matters? First, God said he is always carefully watching the land, a land for which Jehovah your God cares. The eyes of Jehovah your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year. God has given the land of Israel to the Jewish people as an everlasting possession. Also, I will give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God warned Israel not to sell his land. The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. God warned never to make a peace treaty with other inhabitants occupying his land. "And I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the sea Philistia, and from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods." God never wanted a Palestinian state. "They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me, for if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." Yeshua will give only 2 reasons for his return to fight for Israel. One is his people, and the second, his land. "I will also gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land." The attempt by all the nations of the world to force Israel to return to the 1967 borders will be the event that causes the Messiah to return to fight for Israel. "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples, when they lay siege against Judah, the West Bank, and Jerusalem." Isn't it amazing how Zechariah knew 2,500 years ago the exact areas that would be in contention today? The West Bank and Jerusalem. Zechariah continues by saying, "And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces. though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it. Skipping down 2 more chapters, Zechariah describes what can only be interpreted as the United Nations forcing Israel to return to the 1967 borders. Behold, the day of Jehovah is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then Jehovah will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. Just look at this map and you will see that the eastern half of the city is taken and the western side of Jerusalem is not cut off from the rest of Israel. Trump's deal of the century has Jerusalem in the very predicament described by Zechariah. It is obvious that all the nations of the earth, that is the United Nations, will come to enforce UN Resolution 242, which gives East Jerusalem back to Jordan, or in this case, the Palestinians. They don't take the western half of Jerusalem because Resolution 242 doesn't require Israel to give that up. Zechariah saw the exact scenario that we have happening today, to the very minute detail. This prophecy should be adequate to convince even the most adamant skeptic that there is a living God and He is the God of Israel. There is another method that God uses to warn as well as prove that He foreknows the future. He gives signs in the heavens. Yes, we know the orbits of the sun, moon, and planets follow mathematical equations, and to many this doesn't seem to be very divine. However, someone has evidently pre-programmed these orbits to coincide with historical events. The level of intelligence required to accomplish this, by any definition, has to be divine. Let's look at how President Trump's peace initiative just happens to coincide with 2 total solar eclipses over America. The first total solar eclipse happened on August 21st, 2017. It ominously made a path over 3 unstable geological areas. First, it bisected the Cascadia subduction zone off America's west coast. This region has at least 12 volcanoes as well as an offshore fault. Next, the solar eclipse path clipped the lower portion of Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, a region well known for its extensive thermal geologic activity. Finally, the solar eclipse path crossed over the New Madrid fault line in southern Illinois. So we actually have 3 warning signs here. First, a total solar eclipse is a warning sign all in itself. Second, the solar eclipse path crossed 3 geologically unstable areas in America. And third, as we will see, the timing of this total solar eclipse was a warning too. Here is a live stream video from NASA of the American total solar eclipse of August the 21st, 2017. Please note the levity in which the participants took the situation. There is absolutely no concern that this might be a warning sign. Everyone thinks of it as a dramatic display solely for their entertainment. There is joy and cheering for an event that in ancient times would have had the entire nation fasting in sackcloth and ashes.
The crowd's getting really excited too.
Hey guys, who back there is excited for the solar eclipse? Wow, it's getting closer.
Wow. It's just getting really close to nighttime. It's incredible. It's like very dim.
Definitely it feels like dawn or dusk here in Hopkinsville right now as it's getting closer.
Come on! And you can see on our feed, there's that tiny, tiny little sliver left to go. And it's really starting to get dark now. Wow. It's
Goodness
like dusk.
gracious.
And you can see the pink color around the horizon. Oh, it's like a sunset. It's beautiful. It's going. It's going. Just that tiny, tiny last sliver. Oh my goodness.
total solar eclipse,
Wow.
and this is absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah, you can see the corona, that beautiful white wispy crown coming out from the sun in all directions. And we can see airplanes, and I think I see Jupiter in the sky over there. I think I can see Jupiter.
Wow.
And I see other planets too, and stars.
I can only imagine in ancient times what this must have been like.
I know.
Out of nowhere. I am covered in head to toe in goosebumps. A complete chill.
I know,
has come
I
over
am
my
too.
body.
I just can't believe we finally got a chance to see it. I mean, it's one thing to read about it, but it's another thing when you get to see it yourself with your own eyes.
Wow, here in Eclipseville, it has definitely lived up to
And now
its
we're getting
name.
that diamond
Here we
ring
go.
on the
We've
way
got it
out.
coming back. The moon is stepping aside
And
from the
now,
sun. It is getting
totality's over.
brighter. Totality has finished here at Hopkinsville. Wow, that was absolutely amazing, Renee. Can you even try to put it in words?
I can. I mean, I just have goosebumps all over my body.
Wow, this is amazing. We can see the birds flying around in the
we can
distance.
see the sun starting to come out, and it's getting bright again.
This is amazing.
It's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Until the next
definitely.
eclipse
Yeah,
that we'll
exactly.
have only 6 years away, we get to see it again.
Wow, we'll be there.
Yeah.
We will be making
Without
our
a
way.
doubt. I think I'm hooked. I'm an addict.
We have sat in meetings preparing for this for the last 2 or 3 months, and now that it's actually here, it's completely 100% lived up to its billing, and I can't imagine, I can't believe what just happened.
It was just amazing. We were so worried about the weather and the the broadcast and making sure our telescope was set up and everything went smooth, and we just had a blast.
Wow, this has been absolutely amazing.
Just 3 days after the total solar eclipse, we found out what it was warning about. White House envoy Jared Kushner began Trump's Mideast peace push on August the 24th. We will have a second total solar eclipse that crosses America on April the 8th of 2024. And amazingly, it seems that this eclipse will also be linked to America's plan to divide Israel. This is because the U.S. has assured the United Arab Emirates that it won't back any Israeli annexation before 2024 at the earliest. And Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that he won't annex any land without the U.S. support. The Trump administration's Peace to Prosperity plan, unveiled in January of 2020, gives the Palestinian Authority a 4-year window to engage with the peace plan, during which Israel is barred from expanding into these areas earmarked under the plan for a future Palestinian state. The United Arab Emirates received a commitment from Washington that it would hold off on giving its blessing for Israeli annexation based on that same time frame. That is until January of 2024. And 3 months later, we have the second total solar eclipse over America. In the past, as negotiations failed, Israel took more land and built more settlements, which is what they really wanted. Likewise, the Palestinians would get more money from the Arab countries, which is what they really wanted. President Trump has found a way to deny both sides what they were getting. This is intended to force them together to sign a treaty out of desperation. Israel won't get any more settlements, and the Palestinians won't get any more money. America will see to it that Israel doesn't annex any land, and the Arab nations will see to it that the Palestinians don't get any money until they both agree to a state. The monetary squeeze is already taking effect. The Palestinians blame Trump as their funding tanks down by 85%. The New Arab reported that Trump told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he had asked these rich Arab countries not to pay the Palestinians, and the PA has not received any aid from Arab countries since March of 2020. And what happens when 4 years goes by and the Palestinians still haven't agreed to a state? Israel will say that they're not going to wait any longer and they're going to now annex the West Bank territories. The United Nations will then step in and they say, no, you don't. We're going to force a Palestinian state upon you. If the Palestinians won't sign a treaty, then we're going to get all the nations together and sign the treaty for them. This is why Daniel prophesied that the false Messiah would make a treaty with many, not just one or two. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, or period of 7 years. But in the middle of the week, the 7, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. America will go along with this forced dividing of God's land. Every single U.S. president since Jimmy Carter has demanded the same thing. Israel must accept UN resolutions 242 and 338 and a separate Palestinian state. The second total solar eclipse of 2024 will seal America's fate by finishing the drawing of an X over the center of the United States, directly over the New Madrid fault line. Notice that the New Madrid fault line is crossed by both total solar eclipses. So we have a total solar eclipse at the start of negotiations to divide God's land, and another total solar eclipse after 7 years when we end negotiations and physically force Israel to divide God's land. The New Madrid Fault lies along the Mississippi River in western Tennessee and runs down through Missouri and Arkansas, and it extends up into Illinois. Interestingly, the New Madrid Fault has the same shape as the Hebrew letter Dalet, which is like the letter D. And the Hebrew letter Dalet represents a door, a lifting up, or an elevation. And this is exactly how you would describe a fault or an earthquake. We can never say that we weren't warned. The New Madrid Fault is positioned halfway between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico. It could have the potential to split America into two pieces, just like America is going to do to Israel. Indianola, Illinois, and Indianola, Texas, can be connected by a straight line that perfectly follows the New Madrid Fault. Will this be the pathway that determines America's fate? Consider these dreams and open visions from 3 modern prophets that are warning us that this indeed will happen.
And that night I went to sleep and I had a dream. And I don't dream a lot, but there are times that I know that God's given me a God dream, and this was a God dream, and I'll make it brief. First of all, I dreamed that I was suspended over a river, and I thought it was a river down by my house in Alabama. And I looked at the river, and immediately I was thinking, well, what am I doing looking at a river? You know, there was a tranquil river flowing. And all of a sudden that river went out of sight immediately. I couldn't see the bank on either side. It was just like an ocean. And immediately I was taken up and I was transferred into an old school building, like a one big room school building. And I was running through that school building, me and another guy from my church. And that building started bucking like a horse. It just started bucking. To the point in my dream that my teeth was clapping. And my teeth was hurting in my dream because my teeth was clapping so hard. And I looked and I saw that guy flipping around in the room, and I thought, well, if he's flipping like that, I must be flipping like that. And so when the dream was coming to a close, I saw 2 words, and it looked like these words was on like an old Spanish map of antiquities. I saw the word Indianola, and I saw the word Europa. So when I woke up, I was shaking so hard, it was like I had a hard chill. And so my wife, I called her from the other room, and she came in there and held me while I was just shaking. And she said, what in the world, honey? I said, well, listen, I've had a dream, Brenda. And I said, get on the computer and look up Indianola. So she looked up Indianola, and there were 5 of them, but 2 had been destroyed by hurricanes. So there was one in Mississippi, there was one, I think, in Texas, and there was one in Illinois. But when I saw Indianola, I saw a line going from Indianola that way toward a little dot, a little bitty tiny dot called Europa.
Now, I've never heard of these cities until you mentioned them, and I looked them up because they're not on maps. I mean, hardly they're on maps, but they're very, very small cities.
Very small.
Had you ever heard of these cities?
Never.
See, this is what makes me know the supernatural people. when you absolutely have no knowledge. If you would have said Elkhart, Indiana, or Chicago, you know, you would have said, well, I know this, but these were obscure places, small cities.
The thing that let me know which Indianola it was the way the line left Indianola and went toward Europa. It didn't
Yes.
come from Texas. It didn't come from Mississippi. It was the one in Zion, it was the one near Illinois.
Yes.
Near Illinois. And the way the line went from the one in Illinois, it went that way toward Europa, Missouri. Went to the right a little bit, slightly to the right. So when she looked them up on the map and I saw that, I didn't know what it meant. I told a preacher friend of mine that, and he called me back later that day and he said, John, I have put Indianola on the computer and I've put Europa on the computer. And he said, guess what? I said, what? He said, that line and those two cities is exactly the New Madrid Fault. He said, that's exactly the New Madrid Fault. He said, you can superimpose that line over the New Madrid Fault. So I knew then that the Lord was showing me that it was a New Madrid Fault erupting. That thing was bucking so hard, that building was bucking so hard, I'm 6'3", and it was throwing me around like a rag doll, and my teeth, I couldn't keep my teeth from clapping in the dream. And when I woke up, I mean, for me to be shaking like that, that had to be a God dream. It was not a regular dream.
Sure.
Right.
So I believe, this is what I personally believe. I can't prove this. It's just supposition. I believe that it may be possible that that's on hold in the event that America mishandles Jerusalem. If the Secretary of State, whoever that may be in the future, or if the President in the future pressures Israel to divide Jerusalem, and we have a hand in it, I believe the New Madrid is going to bust wide open and divide America. That's what I believe. I think that's possible.
Three other places, so besides St. Andreas, the two other places have been marked for destruction. So
you're saying, when you say three pieces, how did that work out? So where was that, and what was that all about?
Well, I can't say it's a thus says the Lord word for the other two places, but when I tried to look at the map, trying to remember where I saw the angels standing, there was one group of angels who stood in the middle of the U.S.
Oh, yes. We know about where that could be, not too far from here. It's called the New Madrid
I'm
Fault.
sorry.
Yes, it's called the
Is
New
your
Madrid
state?
Fault. It's pretty close to here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It's far enough away from us that it's
We're good.
the New Madrid Fault
Right.
is the largest
Out in the middle.
earthquake fault as far as power.
I see.
I think that's ever in the history, don't you, Mondo?
I agree. Yes, sir.
And they're warning about it,
And it's
but it's something that hasn't gone off in a long, long time. And if it goes, it could split America in two.
so that was
that will happen if U.S. plays a part in dividing Israel into two. You know, in the United
feel
States,
God has spoke that to you?
I was shown that in the year 2013,
Yes.
God called us to do a conference in Israel.
Yes.
So that particular year, we did a conference at Mount Sinai, Egypt, and then the other half was in Jerusalem. So before the conference, the Lord called me to fast for 3 days up on the mountains on Sinai. On the third day of my fast, you know, early in the morning, I just went out to sit on the rock to have my cup of tea and meditating the scripture. And while I was meditating the scriptures, I just looked up to ponder that scripture when I saw a huge angel come and stand before me. And he had a drawn sword in his hand. And as I was looking at him, a 3-dimensional map of the United States appeared beside him. And he thrust his sword in the center of the US, and it split into two. And he said, this will happen to the nation if it divides Israel into two.
Hello, Sid Roth here with Shane Warren, and Shane had a vision of the future of America. Shane, tell me, let's start out about the vision of the storm.
Approximately a year or so ago, I was sitting on the couch. I thought I had fallen asleep, when in reality I was in a vision, an open vision. I have a large screen television in my living room. I was sitting on the couch watching television, and again I thought I was dreaming. As I watched, there was a weather broadcast that was on television, and there was a news anchor who said the most amazing thing is going on right now. It's tragic, and they were building this news broadcast around this event. And he said, normally hurricanes hit on the coastal lines. He said, but there is a hurricane that seems to be spreading down or coming across the heartland of America. At that point, he showed a satellite image of America, and I was horrified as I watched a storm covering from the northern border to the southern border, from east to west, as this massive storm with the eye right over the center of America, a hurricane coming across the center of America.
How can that be?
This is how I believe it happened. Immediately it came back to this anchor. The anchor said, we have somebody on the ground in the eye of the storm. We're going to go to him now. They pitched it to a news reporter. This news reporter in the eye of the storm, and as you would see in a hurricane, the wind is blowing violently and they're being tossed to and fro. He said, this is the most amazing thing. I don't understand it. This is not a natural storm. That was his words. He said, this isn't normal. He said, look at what it's raining. And he reached down on the ground and he's picking up and he holds in his hand a fist of $1 bills. He said, this isn't natural. It's raining dollar bills. And the anchor and this correspondent went back and forth about the meaning of this dollar bills. He said, I don't understand. It's almost like they're worthless. They're worthless. It was raining dollars. About that time it came back to the anchor. He said, ladies and gentlemen, another tragedy has hit America. He said, right in the heartland of America on the New Madrid Fault, a major earthquake has just hit, and immediately pictures of devastation began to pop up all over America, the heartland of America, along the New Madrid Fault, as earthquakes cause entire cities to crumble. And while I was sitting there, I heard a booming voice in behind my ear that said, they have divided my land, now I will divide their land.
And Leviticus says that Israel is God's land. He actually says, this is my land.
And the Word of God goes on to prophesy in Joel, I believe it is, that if we divide His land, that God will divide our land. I never realized the prophetic implications of that, but I knew immediately in my dream or in this vision that He was speaking about Israel, and specifically Jerusalem and all that's going on right now, which tells me that this dream that I've had and all of the issues that are going on with Israel and Jerusalem that's taking place right now, Sid, it tells me that this dream that I had is about to unfold because I heard that.